Hello. Hello, my name is Indhira Udofia. I'm a PhD candidate in the Joint Program in Social Work at the North Carolina A&T University and the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And so today I'm actually going to be presenting a portion of my dissertation research that's currently in process. And so please forgive me if I zoom through it. I just want to make sure we do have some time for dialogue and processing since we did start a little late. So as I mentioned, this is a part of I'm currently in my data analysis phase of my dissertation project. And so this presentation attempts to kind of present some of the preliminary findings and emerging themes while also grounding the conversation in kind of the work and the landscape of religious and spiritual trauma work and culturally responsive resourcing. So just a general flow, we'll just kind of overview the study real quick, then we'll do some gaps in knowledge. I'll talk a little bit about the research framework and design and then talk through my preliminary findings. I will name that some of actually this is not showing up the way it's supposed to. So I'm just gonna refresh the page and see if that will help. But what I will name is that as we are walking through it, I will be drawing from themes from the lit review and things that have shown up when we get to kind of like the qualitative data things. I want to put those in conversation with what I'm seeing in the emerging process of data analysis. So the purpose of this study is to look at the impact of religious trauma in Black church spaces on Black millennials and Gen Zers. It's to kind of address some of the lack of empirical research pertaining to religious trauma within Black church spaces, and to kind of examine the social and cultural relevance of the Black church as an institution and a resource for younger African Americans. Because of the dearth of literature, this kind of is an attempt to serve as a needs assessment to explore kind of the culturally specific phenomena that exists within this kind of relationship between Black millennials and Gen Zers in the Black church and exposure to religious violence and harm. So I just want to kind of name that this study is unique in a lot of different ways, because this study is deeply birthed not only out of just some of the kind of research phenomenon stuff around rise of the nuns, people who are a growing number of African Americans who are deeming themselves spiritual and not religious, but also from a personal perspective. I am a Black queer woman who or genderqueer person that was raised in the South, who grew up in church stuff. I went to seminary and studied Black culture and Black church and Black phenomenology. I have cohorts of models, and I am not only having these conversations around religious trauma and religious harm in the academy, but out in community and belonging. And so this project is an act of embodied womanist dialogue, queer refusal, and abolitionist streaming. It's an attempt to look at a comprehensive look at the impact of religious and spiritual trauma on African American millennials, to provide space for stories to be heard, honored, and validated, but also to create some change and transformation as well. So I think that's important to note, because I think the truth of the matter is that this is not something that is traditional, can be disentangled from my embodied reality and experiences. Sorry, so I had some digital clips earlier, but we're going to speed through those for the sake of time. So the gaps in literature kind of refer to most of the literature that has things that refer to spiritual trauma, whether that's in the academy or out, kind of tend to center itself around the experiences of homophobia and sexism within the Black church. Things that operate outside of those purviews tend to capture more white evangelical experience. And so there's little research that actually names spiritual trauma as a phenomenological experiences that impacts various groups across the Black church. Furthermore, there is some writings in theological accounts, and some sociological of religions around purity culture and the Black marriage crisis, or homophobia in the Black church, or patriarchy's impact on the quality of Black women. But there's actually very little literature, if any, that actually explicitly ties the phenomenon and the construct of religious trauma or religious violence and tries to do a typology of religious harm. So this dearth, right, is not only in social work literature, but religious studies and theology and pastoral care literature as well. And it just highlights kind of the racial inequity that shows up when we're talking about religious trauma, given the emerging of the field being centered in white evangelical and ex-fundamentalist movements. We are just now beginning to identify that maybe people of color have complex or nuanced experiences of religious harm, both in white, evangelical, and multicultural space, but also particularly in their cultural communities. And so my project is an attempt to kind of address some of the gaps and to begin to create space for us to be able to have dialogue in the academy. So just as I mentioned before, this is utilizing Black feminist and queer theory and radical interdisciplinary, given that the Academy has tended to isolate or ignore the complex reality of race and religious trauma. I have to also engage things like art, which is and popular discourses through social media in ways to be able to see how people on the ground are actually discussing and navigating and talking through these experiences and creating their own conceptual frameworks around these concepts of religious violence, religious trauma, religious harm, and religious and spiritual abuse. So I have 3 questions that kind of are guiding my practice. One is kind of rooted in just kind of like the contextualization of religious trauma, spiritual trauma, violence, and abuse within a Black church context. The second one is centered around the engagement and institutional trust. So given in light of having these adverse experiences, how does that impact participation and collaboration with the Black church? And then finally, the last one is building off of that. How do these things impact perceptions of the social and cultural relevance, right? So how are we relying on this institution continuously as a cultural and social resource and relevant institution to engage for our vulnerable populations within the Black community? So I'm engaging in a mixed method studies, as I've kind of alluded to. And so I am bringing together multiple theories and multiple modalities across disciplines in order to explore this phenomenon and to explore this impact. And because of that, I am engaging in a multi-paradigm inquiry. So I'm using not only transformative emancipatory frameworks, but also a dialectic framework, because I'm going to be in conversation not only with sociology, theology, religion, digital studies, cultural studies, in order to be able to have a comprehensive look. And so I just want to kind of highlight for the justification piece of it, right, that we know that Black millennials have had an increase in non-religious practices, including defining themselves as spiritual, not religious. Gen Z has followed in this legacy, and they are also the most digitally connected and most educated generations. And so Generation Z has also been known to practice more progressive political and social movements and using digital spaces for civic engagements and justice. And so digital space is a big part of kind of the triangulation of my data. And I'll talk more about that when I talk through the research phases. For some conceptual frameworks that's kind of guiding the research design and also even some of the analysis that's kind of emerging, we're using a participatory social justice design. This allows me to directly engage through having dialogues and impacts. And I'll talk more about kind of the public faces component of the development and the kind of accountability structure of this research project to make sure that I'm honoring the community to which I am not only a part of, but in constant community and with. And then also lived religion. And so I'm using this framework as it's an ethnographic holistic framework that's kind of in of religion and religious studies, because of the nature of the assumption that religion is something that is not only practiced by ordinary people in everyday life, but religious then shapes the kind of phenomenological experience, right? So it's not, church is not a place you go on Sunday morning. And therefore, things like religious trauma and harm are not things that just only impact your spirituality, but social networking, cultural resources, senses of belonging, et cetera, et cetera. So there's 3 project phases that are kind of happening concurrently. So there's a digital autoethnography that I'll talk more about in a second. There is an adapted survey measure that was the quantitative component of my research project. And then there's semi-structured interviews that are also a part of this process. So if we had time, I would play a clip of a digital kind of space that recorded a homophobic sermon that happened in Kojic congregation. The Kojic Church is one of the 7 historically Black denominations in the Christian tradition. And they were talking about lesbianism and its impact on femininity. And so part of the work that I'm doing is I'm doing content analysis. So I'm watching clips of sermons, seeing what is being shared and purported upon, which platforms are highlighting what types of things, to explore not only contents, but platforms that highlight religious and spiritual trauma within Black church communities, and seeing if those are coming from traditional religious and spiritual trauma spaces, or are they happening offline. Spoiler alert, they're happening in other spaces other than the traditional religious trauma frameworks and spaces. Also, we're doing some reflective processing in digital space. So part of the coding process has actually been developing and coding in community with folks and developing a podcast around the topics and talking more about the ways that I'm experiencing it. So the podcast is serving as not only ethnographic field notes for myself, but also ways to be in dialogue with people in the community that I've come across over digital space, and also in my kind of social circle that are talking through some of the issues and the themes that are emerging from our qualitative and quantitative data collection process. And so this is an act of dialogue and reflexive and performative ethnographic method and notion, using it in Twitter spaces, in podcast episodes, in Twitter threads, and even on some social media platforms. And I might, if I have time, I'll share kind of how that is showing up. And then finally, we're developing a typology of culturally reflexive, a culturally reflexive typology of religious harm. So I'm actually cataloging the types of digital content and resources for culturally specific occurrences of religious harm, as well as some of the resources that are catered to this population in digital space. So some of the insights that have kind of emerged so far is that there's kind of 3 major kind of brands or themes or categories of digital content that is kind of occurring when we think about the intersections of the Black church experience and religious trauma or spiritual violence. There's kind of Black church content, meme accounts or highlight accounts, as similar as the clips that I showed earlier with trying to highlight maybe gossip or blogs, right? So that's one way that Black millennials and Gen Zers are actively either naming or calling out things that are considered religiously violent or religiously harmful. Normally, that's the way that shows up, is that, you know, folks might post a service in which something that may have been viewed as like not okay, or something that might have been viewed as violent or disruptive. And there's dialogue in the comments around like, this is why I don't go to church. And like, this is kind of a manifestation of like the hubris behind the pulpit or greed behind the pulpit, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's this actual targeted Black church social commentary space. These are places like Unfit Christian, Holy Smokes podcast, a couple of like the gay magazines where they actually are posting clips, posting current events within Black church cultural moments, and providing commentary and feedback. These are also spaces in which they have provided support, right, for folks who are considering themselves deconstructing or removing themselves from Black church cultural space, right? Giving them opportunities to translate their experience or translate other forms of spirituality that may have occurred in the Black church that are still helpful without being tied to the institution that is causing harm. And then finally, there's actual like spiritual trauma, abuse, recovery coaches and accounts. These ran across theological perspectives. And so not all platforms are created equal. And so what I'm hoping to kind of continue to tease out is kind of how this space continues to be shaped, right, by community. And as more folks are naming or talking about religious trauma, there's also a semblance of being able to have some like feedback that the Academy then can kind of negotiate. Secondly, there's the reflexive process, right? So I'm using Twitter, I'm using Instagram, I'm using different spaces to be able to kind of speak back to what I'm experiencing, because as our previous presenter, a panelist mentioned, doing this work is hard. And so part of collective community care is being able to have reflective insight. So I'm making sure that the things that I'm feeling and perceiving are reflective of the community that I'm beholden to in my work. And also there are some ways in which like this digital work is talking about the commodification of spiritual trauma recovery work. And that is something that is going to be growing in my research agenda. And then finally, some of the typology insights, there is kind of shifts in the kind of race and representation. There are more and more people of color who are talking about their experiences within white, evangelical, and multicultural church spaces. And then there are folks who are building platforms, people like Kristen Smith and Donnell Wright, who are actually talking about being raised in the Black church tradition and experiencing religious and spiritual harm and abuse. And so we're beginning to build that typology, but again, it's still mostly in a digital space and not reflected in our academic presumptions. So I am going to move a little bit quickly. I want to name that I've posted one of the quotes from actually the interviews that kind of reflect these insights that were emerging from the digital ethnography. So this, the person's pseudonym name is Eva, who's 33 and identifies as an atheist, named that when she was about 18, she was looking for resources online for people who no longer believed in God and were Black. And there were like two groups and there were a few people in there. And that she has noticed over the years that this phenomenon has grown, and now there's multiple groups around non-belief or Black agnosticism, and that there's a lot of community that's being developed in digital space in light of this shift in spirituality. So I thought that was interesting. Some other emerging insights, yet again, mentioning the commodification of deconstruction and reverting to African traditional spirituality, spiritual entrepreneurship and the ethics behind it. Again, this is a theme that people are kind of talking about. What is the new Black church and what is the new Black spirituality? And how are people monopolizing, or how is capitalism impacting our relationship with these frameworks? And also just the role of streaming, right? Now we have more readily available digital archives of harm in light of the fact that the people are now streaming online, folks are now in dialogue and sharing clips on social media. And so there is this kind of growing digital typology that's existing. And also, social media provides direct critique and impact and dialogue between folks who may be impacted by harm and the perpetrators of harm. And seeing that kind of dynamic has been very interesting, to say the least. The second part is an adaptive survey. There was a demographic form that was filled out and adapted questions from the Perceived Spiritual Support Survey, the FACTS survey, or the Faith Communities Today survey, and then the recently formed Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale clinical screener form created by Cook and Edstrom. And so what this did was to be able to assess perceptions of care and confidence for Black church leaders and communities, to explore religiosity and religious participation, to assess senses of belonging and community, and to measure the types of harm and exposure to violence that was existing. So I'm going to just throw some stats. We haven't gotten to regressions yet, but over 50.9% of the survey participants were actually in Gen Z, which will posit and reflect about the people who actually responded to the calls for interviews being 75% of millennials at this time. Also, 54.3% of the survey respondents named that they were treated less than because of their gender, race, sexual orientation, and class, which is one of the highest occurrence of harm that was named through the spiritual harm and assessment survey question that was in our demographic form. Other demographic survey demographic stats that are interesting, 55.5% of survey participants cite an average or less than average relationship with the Black church, which is a majority. Also, 87.5% of survey participants cited experiencing hearing hell used as a deterrent for questioning anything, including politics, practices, and beliefs or norms, and people citing that as a negative or an adverse experience for them. 78.7% of survey participants cited that exposure to adverse religious experiences diminishes the perception of safety within the Black religious tradition. And the sample size that I am deriving from is 173 participants of a digital survey that was disseminated through Qualtrics, and then the data was cleaned for eligibility criteria that I will discuss. Again, just to highlight another kind of qualitative interview that kind of reflects the survey participant information back at me. This is from a Gen Z participant named Veronica, age 22, who identifies as agnostic. And so she talks through this quote, she talks about the fact that while communities and resources are focusing and politics are focusing on the church, that there's not she doesn't see her generation being reflected in that space, and they're actually neglecting the other ways that Black millennials and Gen Zers are gathering and resourcing and power among themselves. And so her call is for people in our industry of social service, social work, social science, to be able to begin to think about where are the other places that Black people are gathering that's not the church. The final one was semi-structured interviews. So the interview and participants must have been from 1981 to 2002. They must identify as African-American. And I set a criteria that they had to previously attend or currently attend a church located in the Southern United States. I did that based off of critical geographical studies that talked about the fact that the predominant site of kind of like African-American culture can be still kind of situated and interrogated within Black space being Southern space. And so using the South as a site for inquiry could be a pure way of understanding kind of the shaping of an institution, as folks tend to flee the South for refuge or to remove themselves from religious contexts in the North or the West. I'm going to move quickly through this. Again, some of the emerging themes and thoughts that are kind of coming up. There's been an interesting relationship between the proximity of power and the impact of harm. Consequently, because of the way that the random sample fell and who responded to the survey and quickly, I have over 87.5% of the respondents have highlighted some relationship of harm being tied to their family systems and religion. So they were either former PKs or they come from a line of preachers and families and pastors, people in church leadership. In addition, there have been other notions of disenfranchised identities having larger exposures to maybe more overt harassment and instances of religious harm and violence. Again, the role of capitalism and education on perceptions of safety, the kind of indictment of mega church culture's impact on Black church sociality, and the economic disparities impacting resource models and predatory behaviors occurring within a church space. And then finally, one of the major themes that another kind of emerging theme or thought that's coming up is the decentralizing of the church in resourcing. So because of diminished confidence and the creation of cohort specific spaces of resources, whether that's, digitally supported mutual aid or being able to just kind of have giving groups or social groups that you can give to, or actually collaborating with the nonprofit sector, it has now reduced the centrality of the church as a continued site of intervention for Black folks. And we're going to move and we move. I just want to highlight some of the literature that's kind of talked about how this overall phenomenon and increased religious disaffiliation across denominational lines among millennials. So 1/3 of Generation Z reports having no religious affiliation whatsoever. And millennials and Gen Zers are have less overall childhood religious socialization since the boomer generation. And Gen Z's ties to religion seems weaker than the millennials. I have posted kind of like examples of kind of some of the social media posts that come up, some groups that have gathered, and also just kind of the growing kind of trend among atheists, agnostics, and just nuns in particular. So how this kind of reflects in the qualitative data is that one of our participants whose name is Brahms identifies as a Christian, is age 35. When asked about what their relationship was to the Black church, they said it was nuanced and actually likened it to an abusive relationship. You know that it's not good for you for many different reasons, but when you try something else, it's just not the same. Again, just identifying some of the literature data around shifts in participation. 8 out of 10 African-Americans identify as a Christian, but between 2007 to 2014, Black Americans who identified increased from 12% to 18%. That has recently grown since the 2018 Pew Forum research report. And then 63% of the silent generation say that identify with historically Black denominations, where only 40% of Black millennials say the same. One of the things I just want to highlight before we go to the next slide is that there's increased openness for Generation Z to engage in white or multicultural church spaces rather than Black church spaces. So the culturally specific Black church experience is actively dying across generations. One of the things I wanted to provide some nuance is that, again, geographically speaking, folks have presumptions around participation, but it's not necessarily reflected in kind of the full reality. And so Eva, who identifies as an atheist, talks about how she even questions whether or not the church is a central or social institution. Like because of her removal, she's not sure, but she was like, I can only see that really being a thing if you have nothing better to do, which I think is an indictment on the utility of the church. I'd want to highlight just kind of the literature and the language and the history of religious trauma and religious PTSD. So religious abuse and trauma studies has recently reemerged as a genre for inquiry in and out of the academy. And there's been lobbying for kind of social institutions around whether or not there needs to be a special diagnosis in the DSM for religious trauma. Right now, complex trauma with a religious qualifier is the closest we got, and scrupulosity, which is OCD. And so we have mental health practitioners who are kind of cataloging and defining trauma in real time through the Religious Trauma Institute and the global study of religious abuse. But many of the people who are coming and shaping this are coming from white evangelical, white ex-fundamentalist groups and religious systems. So when asked kind of about it, I just want to identify just two different quotes. One from Veronica, who's 22, not 32, my apologies, who kind of named around the navigating the church as a neurodiverse person and expansive person, and how the ideas of the church reflecting this kind of value misalignment. So the part that I really appreciate about this quote is, I understand more of the neuroconforming world more definitely than I am able to like even do myself, but it's something that I really have problems with, because with the church. They say that, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to do this, that, and the third to you or your problems. But if you start acting a certain way, automatically there's judgment, automatically there's shame, which we talk about shame being a risk factor for things like religious PTSD and moral injury. Furthermore, Thelonious, who's age 33 and identifies as Christian-ish. So I can sit here and I can tell there has been times I've sat in church and I've cried, not because of what the pastor said, because I just didn't want to be there at the time, or like I didn't want to be on this earth at the time. And I felt like there was only one place I could be at. And it was not because of the family that was there, but because it felt like God was there. And then he continues to talk about how the fact that the church didn't hold space for his depression ended up being a really risk factor for his continued mental health. So just where I'm at, so we have archive data. We're currently in analysis on all 3 phases. I've been able to scrub and I've put the interviews on pause so that I can kind of make sure that I have a great reading before I can fully name that I reached saturation, although I feel it. So I just want to stop here and invite any kind of comments, questions, or curiosity. Thank you.
Indira, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So a quick one. I'm just wondering, have you come across any unexpected preliminary findings?
Yeah, a few. So when I went through the survey data, despite some of the kind of initial findings around how these negative experiences impact participation and impact trust and confidence, there's still an overwhelming majority of folks who still considered the Black church as good for Black people. Or good, or a site of resourcing in the survey. And then when I do the interview, it is very clear that that's not reflective of everyone's reality. And what I am finding, or what I am kind of gesturing towards in my kind of analytic, is that I think what is happening is that the Black church traditionally feels like an institution that is too big to fail, because it's one of the last standing cultural institutions we have, especially in the American context. And so despite everything, to borrow the words of a sage, Hazel, if you can't go to Bella Noche, where can you go? So if you can't find community in the Black church, there's not many other spaces to find purely Black cultural space. And so I think part of the kind of tension or emerging kind of surprising things is, as much as folks don't trust the church, won't trust people to go to vulnerable populations to the church, they're not saying that they wish the church would die, right? They're not saying that the church cannot be redeemed. There's still this kind of what we would call in theological study resurrection or eschatological hope that eventually the church will get itself together. And to answer John's question, I have talked to Black church leaders just by circumstance of who responded to the interviews, but I have not identified. That's part of my kind of research agenda, to look at clergy, Black clergy formation, Black clergy vocational satisfaction, and the impact of religious harm on the formation of their vocational identities and their life and their job satisfaction. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about like the survivors and the community care. Have you noticed in talking to kind of the victim survivors in your storytelling that they've built some organic community support around some of their kind of like trauma narratives? Did you see anything emerging in some of the storytelling around alternative resourcing in those communities?
Wow, that's a good question. And how I'm starting to do my work in a different way is typically not to do what a lot of researchers have been doing, kind of like the helicopter type of data collection. Then you disappear, then, you know, somewhere along the way, you reappear again to ask for more data. So I'm trying to keep in touch with them, but in keeping in touch with them, you realize that the facilities, they can only stay in the facilities for a certain period of time. And after that, there's a policy that they need to transition into the communities. And a lot of them lose touch with the organization that assisted them, which I think it is a pity. Because subsequently we found out that some of them have actually been re-trafficked. So that speaks to there not being good enough support structure for them when they're resettled in the communities. And we need to be thinking a lot more long-term in terms of what they actually need once they leave, or perhaps letting them stay as long as they want to stay until they're able to transition on their own. One of the quotations that I read was this young person whose trafficking story started when she was 13.
Mhm.
And when I was doing the interviews with her, she had been in the shelter for at least 3 years. And you can see the difference between her, who's been in the shelter for 3 years, who's been allowed to be in the shelter for 3 years. And that's mainly because of her age when she got out of the trafficking situation, but also how she identifies herself. So she's one of the ones who says, I'm a survivor on the way to being a warrior, you know? But if I looked at somebody else who I had interviewed, who'd only been there for 3 months, their coping or survival strategies are not quite as developed. And they also are not trusting of the other survivors or victims around them, because in a trafficking situation, it's your fellow victims who would actually snitch on you. So it's quite a long-term process, but also trying to get them to support each other beyond the agency. That's important.
Yeah. Thanks for answering that. That's very interesting, because you would think peer support would be something that would be a naturally emerging thing. So it's not surprising given how you contextualize it, but initial impulse would assume that peer support is one of the kind of more effective ways to have a protective factor. So yeah, it's cool.
Awesome. Yeah. John, Jaspreet, Lubaba, Rochelle, does anyone have questions, compliments, anything that you want to contribute to either Indira's study or what we kind of like hope to do next? Yeah.
No, that was great. I don't have any questions. I think these were such fruitful and important studies. So thank you so much. I didn't even think about reframing, especially yours, Ajbang, in the context of spirituality and a lot of the work that you do. And I realized how important and I think critical it is to look at that lens and why that's framed in that way. So thank you. I don't know, I'll leave it up to the audience if anybody has any big questions for both of you.
I don't have any questions. I just find it interesting to think of all of the different ways that people are engaged with their religious communities and the different ways that people feel vulnerable when these communities are not as helpful as we imagine religious communities to be.
Yeah. Thanks, Lubaba.
Thanks. Indira, I just thought it was quite interesting, the notion that you mentioned around spiritual entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Because we're seeing that within the context of trafficking. So using spiritual or religious ways to actually either traffic the victims or put them in those situations of trafficking whilst they are earning money, exploiting the person, you know?
Yeah.
And some of the traffickers I've actually spoken to say, no, but that's business, that's part of entrepreneurship, you know? So it's quite interesting to see that continuum of what is actually spiritual entrepreneurship, you know, and where is it business legit in ways that are actually abusive, violent, and exploitative as well.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Esther Akalaste, Dr. Esther Akalaste, but she used to be my pastoral care, and she talked about African charismatic movements and demon possession, and how that's like a whole business. And so that kind of opened my kind of antenna a little bit, taking that course. And so even now, like as I'm doing digital work, right, and I'm on Instagram, now healing is a commodity. And in that means that as folks are becoming more desperate for resources, for ways to make meaning, for ways to restructure their world, they're becoming more and more susceptible to maybe more maladaptive practices, or even just financial abuse. So one of the kind of ways that I remember, like, just literally in doing like my content analysis, is there was a divine feminine one-day workshop course that was supposed to teach people how to tap into their divine feminine as African people of African descent, right? And the course was $1,000 for a day on Zoom in the height of COVID, right? So even if there was good or constructive information, to squeeze people in a moment of vulnerability, of economic insecurity is deeply, deeply troubling, right? Even seeing how certain kind of folks who have now taken African traditional religions and have transposed it into a nebulous spirituality that's not necessarily grounded, right? Charging for candles, charging for spirit work, not being well versed in the tradition, pulling it out, right? Making waist beads as a business, right? When it's deeply rooted in a cultural context. So, I think it's so easy to kind of walk your way forward, walk your way towards it. The ways that relationship coach, right, start setting people up to have abusive relationality, right, by teaching and purporting purity culture, and sometimes even just rape and violence as a spiritual way to embody marriage. So yeah, I definitely can see how spiritual entrepreneurship can feed into the kind of sex trafficking problem by grooming people into these type of relationships.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yes. Well, I don't want to take up anybody else's time.
Exactly.
If no one has anything else to say, maybe we can stop it here.
Thank you for attending our presentation. And
Thank
Indira, I might be in touch, and I'm looking forward to the end. But I know it's